Have you ever stopped to think about how secure your privacy actually is? I mean, really think about it for a second. When you close your front door, walk down the street, or even just hand over a package to be shipped, where exactly does the government's power hit a brick wall, and where do your personal rights take over? Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack the fascinating and honestly sometimes pretty shocking boundaries of your constitutional rights. All right, let's just dive right into this. We're going on a bit of a journey today through four absolute landmark Philippine Supreme Court cases. Think of the Constitution kind of like a giant invisible shield. In theory, it's there to protect you from the awesome, sometimes totally overwhelming power of the state. But how strong is that shield in the real world? When does it hold firm and when does it just poof, completely vanish? Let's look at the hard evidence. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the presumption of innocence. Second, banning the general warrant. Third, we've got the exclusionary rule. Fourth, the limits on stop and frisk. And finally, the private citizen loophole. Let's get started. Section 1. The presumption of innocence, the ultimate safety net. Now, to understand how strong this safety net really needs to be, we have to look at a pretty dark, tragic case. People versus Dramayo. See, the presumption of innocence means that simply being accused of something is never, ever the same as being guilty, right? The state carries this massive burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They need what the courts call moral certainty. But what exactly happens when the state actually meets that extremely high bar? Well, let's look at the grim facts of the Dramayo case. Back in January 1964, Pablo Dramayo and his accomplice, Paterno, a Cuban, had a terrifying problem on their hands. A man named Estelito Nogaliza was set to testify against them in a robbery case. So, to silence him, they literally ambushed the guy. A Cuban struck him with a piece of wood, and Dramayo fatally stabbed him with a bolo. It's awful. Dramayo even tried to cover his tracks, claiming the blood on his pants was from his daughter's skin ailment. Yeah, no way. The evidence against them was meticulously gathered. So, the Supreme Court ruled that, yes, while the presumption of innocence is absolutely paramount, it was completely shattered here by undeniable proof. The takeaway? The shield protects the innocent for sure, but it can't hide the guilty once moral certainty is actually reached. Moving on to Section 2, banning the general warrant, shielding against the state. Okay, so we know the Constitution protects you from being presumed guilty right off the bat. But what happens when the state itself threatens your privacy by basically just fishing around for evidence? 42. That is a staggering number. In the historic Stonehill versus Diokno case, an unbelievable 42 search warrants were issued against Harry Stonehill, his associates, and their corporations. But here's the crazy part, the kicker. The warrants didn't even name a specific crime. They just vaguely waved at violations of central bank laws, tariff and customs laws, the Internal Revenue Code, the whole shebang. They essentially authorized the police to seize basically every single business record in existence. While the Supreme Court took one look at this absolute mess and declared it a legal heresy, this situation brilliantly illustrates the extreme danger of what we call a general warrant. Basically, a general warrant is an unconstitutional warrant that fails to specify a distinct offense or exactly what items are to be seized. It's way too broad. The court argued that allowing this would completely wipe out our fundamental right to privacy. It would put the sanctity of your home entirely at the mercy of whatever law enforcement felt like doing that day. To get a warrant, a judge has to find probable cause for one specific offense. You absolutely cannot just go on a fishing expedition. Which brings us to Section 3, the exclusionary rule explained, the fruit of the poisonous tree. Now, declaring a warrant unconstitutional is, just words on paper if there aren't any real-world consequences. So what actually happens to the evidence they scoop up during an illegal search? Listen to this quote directly from the Stonehill ruling because it is incredibly powerful. All evidence obtained by searches and seizures in violation of the Constitution is, by that same authority, inadmissible. Boom. The court decided to throw out the old doctrines and fully adopted the exclusionary rule. If the search is illegal, the evidence is out. Period. It practically becomes invisible in a court of law. So the absolutely crucial point here is this. The exclusionary rule doesn't protect you by punishing the police after the fact. No, it protects you by completely removing their incentive to break the law in the first place. Think about it. If the government knows they can't profit or build a case from their own lawless behavior, they just won't do it. The state cannot use dirty, illegal methods to secure a clean conviction. Makes sense, right? All right, Section 4. Stop, frisk, and probable cause. The limits of the shield. Now, you might be wondering, do the police always absolutely need a piece of paper signed by a judge to search you? Well, Not exactly. Let's walk through the really tense timeline of Sammy Mulligat's arrest. Back in August 1990, Plaza Miranda was historically notorious for bombings, high-tension area. 2 days after chasing an unidentified group there, police spotted Sammy Mulligat just standing at a corner. And their justification for being suspicious of him, his eyes were moving very fast. That's it. The police walked up, searched him without a warrant, and allegedly found a fragmentation grenade tucked into his waistline. The very next morning, they took a confession from him, but without a lawyer present. So the big question is, was this warrantless search actually legal? To answer that, the court had to look at the strict criteria for a valid stop and frisk, which is also known as a Terry stop, and it requires a very specific sequence of events. First, an officer must observe genuinely unusual, suspicious conduct. Second, that conduct has to give them a genuine reason to believe criminal activity is actually afoot. Third, they must reasonably believe the person is armed and presently dangerous. And only then, step 4, can they do a carefully limited pat-down of outer clothing just for weapons to ensure safety. And this right here brilliantly illustrates exactly why the police failed in the Mulligat case. Guys, having fast-moving eyes while standing on a street corner at dusk, that's not a crime. It definitely doesn't create reasonable suspicion. Plus, the police openly admitted they couldn't even see any visible bulge indicating a hidden weapon before they initiated the search. They lacked any personal knowledge of a crime actually being committed. And to top the whole thing off, taking Mulligat's confession without an independent lawyer present directly violated his constitutional rights. Because the police completely blundered the procedure, both the grenade and the confession were thrown out, and Mulligat was acquitted. The shield held firm. Now for our final piece of the puzzle, Section 5, the private citizen loophole, when the shield drops. So we've talked about the state, but what if the person searching your private belongings isn't a police officer at all? What if it's literally just a regular person? Get ready for a massive legal plot twist here. The facts in the People v. Marty case start off innocently enough. August 14, 1987. A guy named Andre Marty goes to a forwarding agency in Manila. He wants to ship 4 gift-wrapped packages to a friend in Zurich, claiming they just contain books, cigars, and gloves. He fills out all the standard paperwork, leaves the boxes on the counter, and heads up. But then, the proprietor of the shipping agency, a man named Job Reyes, did something totally unexpected. As part of his own standard operating procedure before sending stuff to customs, Reyes conducted a final inspection. He opened the box and immediately smelled a really peculiar odor. He squeezed a bundle of what were supposed to be gloves, but to him, it felt exactly like dried leaves. Curiosity gets the better of him, so he opens the cellophane and bam! He discovers marijuana. Reyes immediately calls the National Bureau of Investigation, the NBI, who rush over and take custody of the drugs. Naturally, Marty claimed his constitutional right against illegal search and seizure was violated. Now notice the stark, almost night and day contrast here. If the NBI agents had just walked in and opened that box without a warrant, that evidence would be completely inadmissible, just like we saw in the Stonehill and Mulligat cases. But the NBI didn't open it. Job Reyes, a totally private citizen, did. The Supreme Court ruled that the Bill of Rights strictly governs the relationship between the individual and the state. It is a restraint on sovereign government authority. It does not apply to the actions of private individuals. This quote from the ruling really just hits the nail on the head. In the absence of governmental interference, the liberties guaranteed by the Constitution cannot be invoked against the state. Wow, because Job Reyes acted entirely on his own initiative for his own business purposes and the government had zero part in the actual search itself, the marijuana was perfectly admissible in court. Turns out, your constitutional shield only protects you from the government itself, not from the curious proprietor of a shipping agency. So, after exploring all these incredible cases together, from the heavy burden of the presumption of innocence to the absolute banning of general warrants, the incredibly strict rules around stop and frisk, and finally that wild private citizen loophole, we're left with a really provocative thought. If the Constitution only restrains the state and private citizens operate completely outside of that specific shield, who is really protecting your privacy in our modern interconnected world? It's definitely something to think carefully about the next time you drop off a package or even just walk down the street. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, always keep questioning the world around you.